Hello, my name is Tyshawn, and this is Legacy Liner. Welcome aboard. So today is actually a special day. It is the 37th year anniversary of the wreck of the Titanic being discovered. And so I decided I wanted to do a video detailing how they found the ship and the technology that had to go into it and the consequences afterwards. This is going to be a two-part video at least because let me tell you, I've been researching this for the last month and through several documentaries, a bunch of different books. There is so many layers to this. Government cover-ups, the media threatening lawsuits, nuclear submarines. It just goes on and on. So, without any further delay, let's get into it. So the thought of finding the wreck of the Titanic, it actually started right after the sinking. A bunch of wealthy families actually proposed the idea of sending an expedition to go look for the ship. One of those being Vincent Astor. He wanted to find the body of his father. Luckily for him, his father was among one of the few hundred people whose bodies was recovered by the McKay Bennett, so that's whenever Vincent Astor decided to pull out of going down to the wreck of the ship. Now granted, the technology to do this just simply did not exist in 1912, and I think it was hard for regular people who didn't have any type of nautical or oceanography background or understanding to really wrap their head around just how difficult it would be to get to the wreck of the Titanic. You see, the wreck of the Titanic is underneath 2.5 miles of ocean. The wreck is 12,500 feet deep. So getting down to those depths is impossible for any human being. You would need specialized submarines. And even then, there aren't that many, or at least there weren't back in the 80s, that was capable of getting down that deep. So now in this story, we jump to the 1970s at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts. There was a scientist there named Dr. Robert Ballard. For his career, he did a lot of deep diving. He actually went down and saw hydrothermal vents, underwater canyons, different types of marine life. And in order to do that back in those days, you had to get in manned submersibles. And Dr. Robert Ballard has said that it's like being in a freezing elevator. Because as you go on these deep ocean dives, the deeper down that you descend, the less sunlight is penetrating through, which means that the temperature drops. So it's a very uncomfortable experience. It might take you 2 hours just to sink down to the ocean floor, and then when you spend however much time down there actually exploring, then you have a 2-hour ascent back to the surface. So it's really not that comfortable of an experience. Dr. Robert Ballard actually came up with the idea of what he called telepresence. This was being able to see the ocean floor and see what's down there without actually having to go down there yourself. Having these advanced cameras that can show you real-time footage of what's happening on the ocean floor. In 1981, he actually published this idea. He did like a little diagram showing this video sled and this little miniature robot that could go in the deep ocean and explore these areas. And at the time, it must have seemed a bit kind of like sci-fi. You know, today we have that everywhere, but in the early 80s, that would have been something that would have been like something out of James Bond. But Robert Ballard, being the persistent man that he is, he actually pushed through and he made Argo and Jason. Argo was like this sled that was designed to be towed underneath the ship. It had a series of cameras and sonar on board, so that way you could get an idea of what the ocean floor looked like, as well as looking on your monitors and seeing what's down below. Jason was a little ROV, or remotely operated vehicle. You can kind of picture this as being an underwater version of a drone, something that you can kind of use your controls with to navigate, and it can really get a closer look at whatever it is that you're trying to investigate. So the way that I would describe it is Argo would have been the thing that would let you know that there's a shipwreck down below. And Jason, the little ROV, would be the little thing that you can control to actually go take a closer look. Because with it having its own motors on it, it kind of had a little bit more freedom to maneuver around and see what was going on a shipwreck. And I say that they were used to explore shipwrecks, but the reality is these were built for oceanography purposes. So they were actually designed to take a closer look at what's going on the ocean floor, and exploring shipwrecks and finding shipwrecks was just kind of a side thing that they could do as well. Which brings me to one of the major issues that Dr. Robert Ballard had. He was an oceanographer, and even though he had a strong interest in finding the wreck of the Titanic, finding funding to go to the wreck of the Titanic was a whole different story. Like I said, Woods Hole is an oceanographic institute, so they really didn't have that much interest in finding the wreck of the Titanic. Yes, that would be good publicity for the school or something, but that's not really what they were about. And even though Dr. Robert Ballard wanted to find the Titanic, he wasn't the only person out there looking. There were a couple of people who had the funds and the means and the interest who were going out there looking for the ships themselves, but it just seemed like they didn't really have the knowledge of oceanography and sailing that would be needed to actually successfully pull off one of these expeditions. And just to briefly go over why the sonar aspect is important, sonar on Argo, it would have sent these waves down, these sound waves or pulses, and it would have bounced back to the transducer, which would then paint an image that you could see of the ocean floor. Not really a high quality image, especially back in the 80s, but it can give you a general idea where you look at it and you can see like, oh, that's a shipwreck. Or to a professional oceanographer, they would look at it and say, that's a boulder, that's sand waves. So that's why the sonar part was so important to this. Now, to get back to the issue that Dr. Robert Ballard had with getting funding, the Navy found out about Argo and Jason, these, videos that he made that can get this footage underwater, and they had a task for him that they wanted him to use these machines for. There were 2 nuclear submarines that had sank, the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion. And remember, this is during the time of the Cold War. So they wanted Dr. Robert Ballard to use his technology to go to these shipwrecks to make sure that there wasn't anything from the nuclear reactors that were contaminating the water or marine life nearby. 2, they wanted to make sure that the Soviets hadn't came and tried to salvage any of those nuclear weapons that were on board. They knew a fair amount about the USS Thresher, but the USS Scorpion they didn't know that much about. So Dr. Robert Ballard saw this as an opportunity for one of those I scratch your back, you scratch mine type of things, where he was like, well, hey, if I go explore these wrecks, get the footage that you need, can I use whatever spare time I have to go look for the Titanic? And this would be a great cover story, because they didn't want people to know that they were going to investigate these submarines. So if he's looking for the Titanic, and that's what the general public thinks, nobody's going to question this ship that's just going in all these different patterns, searching the ocean floor. And so the Navy told him, okay, but just make sure you get us the pictures and the footage that we need first. So Dr. Robert Ballard, he went and explored these 2 shipwrecks. One of the things that Dr. Robert Ballard noticed was that both submarines imploded during their descent, meaning that the water pressure was greater than the air that was still inside of the submarines, which caused them to just kind of have like this explosion. Imagine taking an empty water bottle or an empty soda bottle with the cap on it, and you squeeze it as tight as you can. That bottle's just going to eventually pop out. That's kind of what happens with the water pressure. The water pressure being greater on the outside than the air that's trapped on the inside, it just causes that air to explode out and escape wherever it can. So when he noticed this, That was something that he noted probably happened with the Titanic as well. Another thing that he noticed was the debris. So the reason why this is important is because that means heavier things like boilers or big chunks of metal that broke off of the ship, they're going to sink like a rock. But the little things, they tend to get carried away in the water column. So the ocean currents are more likely to cause them to drift away from where they initially entered the water at. So something like a teacup or a saucer, that would be sinking down, but if the currents is pushing it a certain direction, it would just float in that direction for the entire 2.5 miles that it would have had to descend to the ocean floor. One of the other things I think I have to mention is that this was like a joint mission. It was a French-American mission. So the American ship was the Nor, and the French ship was the Le Surot? I don't know how to say that, but that was the ship that was headed by his partner, Jean-Louis. So during its search, the French ship, it came back empty-handed, and right when it was finishing up, that was when it was time for the Nor, the American ship, to head out and do its own expedition. They only had 12 days left to actually go find the Titanic. So the pressure was on, and the mood on the ship, everyone was kind of optimistic, I think, in the beginning from what I read. But as time kind of went on, the morale began to dip a little bit. There was one issue where the cable for Argo actually kind of jumped off the winch and caused some issues, and Argo actually crashed into the ocean floor for a little bit. And the crew that was on watch at that time, they ended up being known as the Crash Crew. Not exactly the best name to have, but that's what they were referred to. And for those of you that don't know what a watch is basically a nautical term for shifts. Usually you work 2 4-hour shifts, one in the morning, one at night. So you might do 12 to 4. That means that from 12 in the afternoon to 4 in the afternoon you're working, and from 12 in the morning to 4 in the morning you're working. And it just alternates that way through several shifts. So that particular shift was the 8 to 12 shift, so they got the name as the Crash Crew. They did have this issue with Argo where it crashed to the sea floor, the cable got damaged a little bit. Thankfully, it was still able to function and they were able to get the situation under control and continue on with the expedition. It just kind of gave everybody that extra kick in the rear to pay closer attention to detail. Another crew on board that got a name was the 4 to 8 crew. So they worked from 4 in the morning to 8 in the morning and 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. And their nickname was the Zoo Crew because they were kind of more like the class clowns of the boat, if you will. There was one story that Robert Ballard said in his book where they walked in to do their shift and they were in a single file line whistling the same theme that the Seven Dwarfs did in Snow White. So they were kind of like the crew that cut up and had a little bit of fun. But I mean, if your shift is at 4 in the morning to 8 in the morning, you do whatever you have to do to stay awake, in my opinion. Now, as you can imagine, this can become very, very boring because for 4 hours, you're staring at these monitors, waiting for something to pop up. So you'll see rocks, mud, and you're waiting to see a teacup, a boiler, anything to hint that there was a ship that sank in that area. So that's hours and hours or days and days of just staring at the plain ocean floor. So it can be a little bit boring and it can lower morale. And at one point, the crew actually began to question Dr. Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis' decision on how they were approaching looking for the wreck. Dr. Robert Ballard mentioned this in his book, and I found it kind of interesting. He had a line in here where he said, "People who knew nothing about the Titanic before stepping aboard the Nor have been reading the various historical accounts sitting on a plotting table, and they have become instant armchair experts." I find that kind of interesting. Like, he's basically saying, I knew more about the ship than they did, but then they read 1 or 2 books and now suddenly they supposed to be experts on where the ship is. But that was the morale that was on the boat. You know, you do sometimes question the decisions being made by management, just like any job. Even though Dr. Robert Ballard was heavily into oceanography, he has been researching the Titanic for quite some time. He had a friend, Bill Tatum, who actually knew quite a bit about the Titanic. Unfortunately, he passed away before Dr. Robert Ballard could find the wreck, but he definitely encouraged him, and he told him, "You're gonna do it, you're gonna find it." So I'm sure that put a little bit of pressure on Dr. Robert Ballard to find it for his old friend. And according to the book, Robert Ballard said that he wasn't that far off with his guess on where the Titanic actually was. Now, some of you are probably wondering, why is it so hard to find the location of where it was at? The Titanic had a wireless system. She sent her coordinates to rescue ships. Why would anybody, not know exactly where she was? Well, the reality was, back in those days, it was celestial navigation. So there was certain human error that was made when calculating the ship's coordinates. And this was also the case with the Titanic. I believe that it was about 10 miles off with the location. And that may not sound like a lot, but you have to take into account that people didn't know exactly how far off those coordinates would have been. What Robert Ballard did to calculate where the ship was he took the coordinates that the Titanic reported, the coordinates that the Californian reported, because remember, that was the mystery ship that was close enough to see the distress rockets that the Titanic was firing off. He then also took the coordinates of where the Carpathia reported that it picked up the survivors. So by paying attention to the coordinates that were reported in these logbooks, he was able to calculate what the ocean currents were doing that night, and therefore he would know what the Titanic's debris would have been doing that night as well. There were two things that was going through Dr. Robert Ballard's mind. One, he was a little bit scared that the Titanic might have been buried by the Grand Banks earthquake of 1929. If that had been the case, the whole ship could have been buried in mud, which was a possibility. The other thing was that there was a canyon not too far from the Titanic wreck site. It actually earned the name Titanic Canyon, and some people were speculating that maybe the ship had sank even deeper by falling into this canyon. Now, the way that he would have did this as far as surveying these areas is that they take and make these lines, a set of lines, and the ship will sail these lines, dragging the machinery behind it, dragging Argo, and it's giving them this sonar image and giving them the video images. And once they get to the end of the line, they would turn the ship around and then do the next line and go to that one, turn around, do another line. It's called lawn mowing, because the same way that you would cut the grass and spin around to make sure you're getting every bit of the grass, they would do that with their sonar, so that way they're making sure that they're covering as much of the sea floor as possible. Almost like you're making a giant mosaic or a giant image of the ocean floor. If you do it that way, you know that you're covered that whole entire area. Now, if they did this and they realize that they missed certain spots, then you can go back in between those lines to kind of fill in the gaps. But that's the general idea. I could go into a lot more detail on how that's done. Whenever I went to school for marine technology, that was one of the things that we had to do. And let me tell you, trying to stay on a survey line is a lot harder than it sounds when you're trying to steer a boat. But that's a whole nother topic. By the night of August 31st, morale was pretty much hitting its lowest point, because even though nobody really wanted to admit it, their 12 days were starting to come to an end, and pretty much everyone was accepting defeat. Even Dr. Robert Ballard himself was beginning to kind of get in his head and accept the fact that, okay, he's going to have to go back home to Woods Hole with his tail between his legs. But then that night, there was a couple of things that he paid attention to. For one of his shipmates, Bill Lang, he actually made a comment, "Tonight we're going to find the Titanic between 2 and 2:30. There was a game that he had apparently. Each night he would guess what time they were going to find the wreck. 2 to 2:30 was roughly the time that the Titanic would have sank and been descending to the seafloor, so that's why he picked that time. Dr. Robert Ballard also noted that as he was going to bed for that night, he heard the song, heard it through the grapevine as he was leaving. I don't know why he put that in the book, but since he felt the need to put that in the book, I just would mention that. Because I do that too. I'll be listening to a song and I'm like, right before this happened, I heard that song. And then forever on, when I hear that song, I think about whatever it is that happened. But yeah, I'm putting that in there. Now, on the Nord, they had what they referred to as a van. And this was like a small little room that had all of the monitors and the scientific gear where they could see what was going on with the expedition. This was kind of like the brain or the epicenter of all the action. And they would go in here because the Nord didn't really have a lab suited for this type of expedition. So they added that on so that they could have their own little area. Around 1 a.m., they began to notice little things showing up on the screen, and they looked like they were man-made objects. And people were beginning to get a little excited, but at the same time, they were a little bit reserved, because remember, at this point, they have been looking for days, so they didn't want to get too excited. Maybe it was just debris that fell off of ships, because this was in shipping lanes. But then they began to notice more and more, and they were starting to get on the fence of whether or not to go wake Dr. Robert Ballard up to let him know that they were seeing things. And I found it funny because in the book, it seems like everyone was scared to actually go wake him up. And as someone who worked on boats myself, I can tell you, for whatever reason, waking up your captain or the person in charge is like the scariest thing in the world, because if you wake them up too late, they'll get mad and be like, well, why didn't you wake me up earlier? But if you wake them up and it's something that turns out to be nothing, then they get an attitude and they're like, well, why would you wake me up for this? You're pretty much damned if you do, damned if you don't. So I kind of laughed when I read that in the book, because I definitely could relate to what the crew must have been thinking at that point. And what ended up happening was that the cook of the ship, he kind of heard the commotion going on in the van, so he walked into the room to see what was going on. And when he came in, the crew actually took him and said, hey, go get Dr. Ballard, or go get Bob. That's what they called him. And so I found that kind of interesting that they sent the cook to go do their dirty work, just in case it ended up being a false alarm. Whenever the cook got to Robert Ballard's stateroom, and he told him like, hey, they're seeing something, you might want to get up there, Robert Ballard was actually reading a book to unwind for the day. And when he heard this news, he actually threw on his little, the little outfit that they wear, that onesie, over his flannel pajamas and bolted up to the upper decks. And around this same time, that is whenever that historic moment happened, whenever a boiler came across the screen and everybody started shouting. And they actually ran and grabbed one of the books about the Titanic that they had and looked at the picture and confirmed this was that Scotch-style boiler that the Titanic had. Robert Ballard ran into the room. The footage of the boiler is there, and everybody is just ecstatic. It has happened. They have found the wreck of the Titanic. They still hadn't seen the ship itself yet, but they knew they were in the area where it possibly sank, and here is a boiler from the ship. So that's pretty much as much confirmation as you needed in that moment. And so everyone was celebrating. They didn't have champagne, so they actually started drinking some wine that they had. And while they were celebrating, somebody, no one there knows who it was, made the comment, it's 2 a.m., the Titanic sinks in 20 minutes. And it was said that the atmosphere in the room, it just went down. Because everybody realized that even though this was a great scientific feat, even though this was great for historians and Titanic enthusiasts, at the end of the day, this was a gravesite. People died here. This is evidence of what their tragic final moments on Earth would have been. Robert Ballard said that he told the crew something along the lines of, "I don't know about y'all, but in 20 minutes, I'm going to go to the fantail and I'm going to have a little moment of silence or memorial for the victims of the sinking." And for the next 20 minutes, he went to be by himself and just kind of process what was happening and what took place in the very spot that they are floating at. And they did, at 2:20 that morning, have a memorial service in honor of all those who lost their lives that night. Now, that was the end of part 1. In part 2, I'm going to go into details of how they actually explored the ship and what the public reaction was whenever they found out about the Titanic being found. Because it did actually cause a lot of controversy for Woods Hole, for different news stations, and there were quite a few survivors that were still alive that initially was a little bit concerned about this wreck being found. But I'll get into that in part 2. Thanks for watching my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.